I want to welcome you to Between Skepticism and Mysticism, an introduction to the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. This entire lecture series on the foundations of the occult philosophy is brought to you totally free of charge, completely open access by the incredibly generous folks that support my work over at my Patreon. This is all a bit of an experiment on providing free content through crowdsourcing education on topics that are just honestly rarely taught in universities at all. And when they are taught, a single class can cost thousands of dollars. If you'd like to support the production of university level open access education and topics in Western esotericism, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, which you can join for as little as $54 a year. It's like buying me a cup of coffee or a beer once a month. But thank you so much for your consideration of supporting the channel and the work like this, and thanks to the patrons of this channel for making this lecture series possible. All right, everyone, welcome back to what is sadly the last installment, at least for now, the final installment of this seminar that we've been running on Cornelius Agrippa and the occult philosophy. And I have to admit, it's a bit bittersweet, bitter in the sense that I'm sad to leave Agrippa behind. I feel like I've made a deeper relationship with an old friend, and I don't want to put him back on the shelf. But at least sweet in the sense that I'll get some time back in the week. These lectures have been significantly more difficult to put together than I thought they would be, but that's a good problem to have, because that means we're really getting into some actual esoteric material, and that's kind of the point of all this. So with that said, we now turn to the afterlife of Cornelius Agrippa. As I said, in 1535, under mysterious circumstances, Agrippa passes out of the world. We don't know exactly what he died of or what he died from, but of course he was less than 50 years old, so he was a relatively young man. Of course, there's a great deal to kill you in 1535, so who knows what it was, but he does pass out of the world. And I would say that he passes more into legend than he does into history. History has been somewhat unkind to Agrippa, but he does in fact pass very much into legend very much. And I'll say that what ends up happening ultimately with Agrippa's thinking, both the skeptical thinking and the mystical thinking, is that Agrippa becomes more celebrated than known, or more hated than known. People don't really seem to be reading his works very deeply, which is in many ways worse than death for an author. You know, when you leave behind something, you want people to read it, and it seems like most people, from what I can tell, don't widely read Agrippa. And that's to be added to the fact that there is no philosophical or magical successor to Agrippa, so far as we can tell. Which is to say, there is no one that comes up later and picks up Agrippa and continues the project begun by people like Pico and Reuchlin, the people we've been talking about for the past 14 weeks or so. The project in many ways seems to come to a halt with Agrippa. John Dee does carry some elements of it forward, although in many ways it's a regression, as we'll talk about in just a bit. But in many ways, Dee's project, or rather Agrippa's project, doesn't go forward in some kind of grand systematic way. There is no continuation of the project, unfortunately. And so in many ways, with some exceptions, the situation kind of falls flat. Agrippa's children, we know he had a relatively large family. Agrippa's children don't seem to at all acknowledge his existence, so far as we can tell. They don't seem to defend him when he is being defamed, and in general, it seems like they're relatively glad to be shut of him. So not quite sure what's going on there, but Agrippa's children certainly don't pick up the mantle, although his family does seem to persist all the way into the 17th century, but they are no longer really associated with him. So the only person really that comes along later to really defend Agrippa and really to stand up for him, as his name is being basically dragged through the mud of history, he's being converted quite quickly after his death, and I would say probably even before his death, into a bit of the thing that he hated. And that is to say, a kind of medieval style necromancer, the Faustian character that Agrippa becomes. And the main person that really stands up to those legends, or is Agrippa's student, Johann Weyer. Weyer was probably Agrippa's student and assistant when he was living in the Low Countries. And in that time period, he seems to have gained a huge respect for Agrippa. And as these legends began to germinate and spread, Johann Weyer feels the need to, in print, defend his teacher's reputation, And in many ways, the main successor in a specific way of Agrippa's legacy, I would say, is in fact in Weyer's very influential De Praestigiis Daemonum, on the trickery of demons. This book, of course, is quite famous. I've done an entire episode on it if you want to check it out. But this book is quite famous because it argued for the first time that the vast majority of women, perhaps all of the women being targeted during the witch hunts, were in fact not witches. Weyer and Agrippa both believed that there were witches, but they were often, in this case, he believed not witches, but rather they were women simply suffering from what we would now call mental illness, what at that time he called melancholia. And so melancholia covered a wide range of symptoms, including things like schizoaffective disorder and manic depression and just regular depression. But mostly Weyer argued that these women were mentally ill and not in consorting with the devil. And so this in some ways lines up with Agrippa. Remember, Agrippa famously defended a alleged witch and on trial and ultimately had her acquitted. Further, Johann Weyer also maintains a deep interest in the occult, and his De Praestigiis is one of the best sympathetic though critical. And again, that really to me strikes of a very Agrippan nature, this sympathetic reading to the tradition of magic, but also a deep criticism and a deep skepticism about, incredulity about all the things that get said about magic. And so in many ways, Johann Weyer, I would argue, is the inheritor of the Agrippan legacy insofar as there is any major carry forward of the Agrippan legacy. Although even Weyer himself would suffer from a bit of an odd fate. Weyer thought that a great deal of the so-called demonic summoning that was going on during his day was basically laughable. And he even publishes as a kind of expose one of these Liber Spiritum, one of these books of spirits in the 6th edition, if I'm not incorrect, in De Praestigiis. And in that edition, he publishes basically a draft of one of these demonic catalogs, and that text he refers to as the Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, the false kingdom of the demons. And that text is basically an early draft, or a draft of a kind of manual that would have been used to summon demons. What's interesting about that draft is that when that is translated ultimately into English and manuscripts by people like Reginald Scott in The Discovery of Witchcraft, that demonic list would become the ground floor for the demonic list of the Goetia and the Lesser Key of Solomon. So again, we have these kind of ironic reversals that Agrippa struggled for his entire life to try to reform magic, and ultimately what ends up happening is he becomes associated with the kind of magic that he sought to reform. Johann Weyer actually ends up in a similar fate, where he introduces what he basically thinks is a joke. He thinks it's a silly list of demons, and that silly list of demons ultimately is recuperated. It ends up being the ground floor for the Goetia and the Lesser Key of Solomon. And of course, I would argue that that text, especially in the 20th and 21st century, has become the most important magical text in many ways in the Western world, at least these days. I think that tide will turn eventually, but I think that's certainly the case. It's also worth pointing out that when Johann Weyer wrote De Praestigiis and argued that basically there were no witches, either there's mentally ill women, one of the people that targeted him after this was King James the First and Sixth. And King James said basically that if you want proof that Johann Weyer is in league with the devil, just go read his De Praestigiis, because the most devilish thing you can do is try to convince people that there aren't witches. And James the First actually called him out by name and said he was in league with the devil. And so he goes from being a relatively minor Dutch doctor to being within the sights of the King of England, and the King of England's analysis of witchcraft in his famous book, The Demonology. So Weyer, I think, is the closest thing we have to an inheritor of Agrippa. But again, Weyer doesn't carry forward the kind of illuminatory, that idea of felicitas. That was the kinds of ideas Weyer is not terribly interested in. But as an analysis of the occult, I would say that Johann Weyer's De Praestigiis is the intellectual inheritor in that direction. Unfortunately, De Praestigiis does not, I think, have an entire English translation at this point. So, as I said, after Agrippa's death, he does maintain a high degree of a good reputation for his erudition. Everyone agreed that he was smart. Everyone agrees that he knows his stuff, that he was widely read and deeply read. And so what ends up happening is that because the three books of occult philosophy is so encyclopedic in character, many people basically treated it like an encyclopedia. That if you want to go to it and get something of sigil magic, you go to there to book 2. If you want to learn something about ceremonial magic, you go pick up a couple chapters of book 3. If you want some natural magic, you pick up a couple chapters from book 1. It became sort of like an encyclopedia of magic. And of course, it's not an encyclopedia of magic. It's not exactly a practical guide to magic either, as we've seen. But that idea that it's basically a thing that you can go pick and choose things out of has unfortunately led to the fact that as people pick things out of it, they didn't actually read the book, and therefore the entire arc of what Agrippa was arguing for is almost always missed. And I will say that even today, I will often see people on the occult subreddit basically say things like the three books of occult philosophy is just the best encyclopedia of early modern occultism. And to me, it's a great tragedy because if you treat the three books like that, basically what you end up with is just piecemeals of things, and you actually lose Agrippa's actual arguments and Agrippa's actual philosophy by treating it as an encyclopedia. So I think this is an unfortunate fate that the three books faced. Of course, he also gained a reputation as a skeptic, and this would really propel him into the world of people like Montaigne, and eventually Descartes would also, in one case, quote Agrippa as a guide to his skepticism. So this would be a place that he was deeply influential, although again, I think influential more in symbolically and name dropping rather than as an actual skeptic along the lines that Agrippa initiated. But he does end up with this kind of title, and famously, of course, he would also end up being famous as an occultist. And I mean occultist here, I mean basically a black magician, a necromancer. Agrippa is associated with necromancy quite early on, and again, much to Agrippa's chagrin, he would have hated this being associated with this. Um, Early on, he's actually mocked as an astrologer. There are some early novels where a character like Agrippa is featured, where he is depicted as an astrologer and sort of a damned sorcerer, a la Faust. Again, this shows you that people know of Agrippa being associated with magic, but if you know anything about Agrippa, you know that astrology, he's quite well trained in astrology, but he's certainly not an astrologer. In fact, he lost a job basically because he refused to engage in judicial astrology. And of course, insofar as he was a practicing magician, he certainly wouldn't have practiced necromancy and made deals with the devil and things like this. The two people, however, that do read Agrippa quite deeply are both Giordano Bruno and John Dee. And this is a place where if you really want to think about how to take Agrippa's magic into the practical world and not go to the so-called fourth book of occult philosophy, the best resource for that, which is going to be Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno did more to actionize the Agrippan magical side of things and deepen Agrippa's sort of magical worldview than I think anyone in that generation. And Bruno's book on magic and Bruno's book on binding are not, they're not really books, they're long essays, but those two essays, insofar as they're not just simply taking things from Agrippa, but they're also deepening them. And I would highly recommend reading those if you want to see the continuation in many ways of how Agrippa's magical theory and his cosmology especially are being brought into the larger system of Giordano Bruno, which is of course very complicated on its own. John Dee would also rely heavily on Agrippa throughout the magical sessions, with the so-called Enochian angelic sessions. In fact, basically what would end up happening is that Dee and Kelly and the angels would basically check things against Agrippa. Agrippa became sort of the touchstone for John Dee, and so if the angels were saying things about angels or about how angels worked or different names of angels, Dee would actually go check them against Agrippa. He really relied on Agrippa that strongly. And so he becomes a touchstone in the world of so-called Enochian magic. And in many ways, if you compare the Enochian magic to the very elaborate system of grids that you see in Book 2 of the occult philosophy, there's a kind of spiritual continuity there in terms of using all these very elaborate grids by which to draw out magical symbols and magical names. So that will continue obviously into the Enochian systems if you study those. So Bruno and Dee are definitely reading Agrippa and incorporating elements of that. This is more true for Bruno's cosmology and his theory of magic here, but in Dee, it's mostly as a kind of touchstone to know how to orient yourself in the otherwise extremely befuddling world of the Enochian spirits. The folks who've studied that will know that that is a completely confusing system of magic, as much as it is one system of magic. But Agrippa remained a kind of touchstone for that. Now, as I mentioned, Montaigne would be deeply influenced by Agrippa. And one of the earliest biographies we get of Agrippa here, you can see this picture on the left. This is one of the more famous pictures of Agrippa. This is the French biography of famous people. Agrippa is given a kind of treatment here, primarily derived from his letters. This is a 16th century biography. We even learned that the main thing that Agrippa's impact had in France was that there were a huge range of skeptics. And the author of this famous book even claims that there were a group of French atheists who claimed that they referred to themselves as Agrippans, and that it was a trend of atheism, which again is very bizarre. Now, the term atheist in the 16th century is a bit complicated, that it doesn't technically often mean that one does not believe in God, but often we would now refer to atheism as something like pantheism. You'll recall that in a century later, what ends up happening is that Baruch Spinoza is also referred to constantly as an atheist, but his position, we might say, is something closer to pantheism, and so pantheism and atheism are more. There are more synonyms at this time period. So, and if you think of Agrippa as a pantheist, that might be more to the point. But yeah, there's allegedly there was a group of French atheists that called themselves pantheists or called themselves Agrippans, but exactly what atheism means in this context is a bit complicated. Um, on the other side of things, Agrippa's erudition for topics in magic and the occult also earned him the ire of all the major religious figures of the day. So everybody had something to say about when they were talking about magic. In order to condemn it, Agrippa becomes the major guy who they're going to turn to. And so John Calvin famously refers to Agrippa as a, quote, mocker of religion. And Martin Del Rio, in his investigations on magic, refers to him as an archmagus. In fact, he compares the only person he compares Agrippa to is Simon Magus. So, insofar as that Simon Magus is the originator of all heresy in Christianity and all occultism in the world in many ways, as a sort of a funnel, Simon Magus is referred to this. The fact that Martin Del Rio, in his investigations into magic, compares Agrippa to Simon Magus shows the deep disdain that Martin Del Rio has, and this is no small thing, folks. Martin Del Rio wrote the most important book in 1599, the most important book on magic basically ever written during the early modern period. This would also be the book that would take over after Malleus Maleficarum was put on the index in 1600. And so Martin Del Rio's investigations into magic becomes the most important book to be used by witch hunters. And so entire generation of witch hunters and heresy hunters would be trained by Martin Del Rio's investigations into magic, and this would be the place where Agrippa's name would be dragged through the mud most systematically. I think that there is at least 7 different references to Agrippa, constantly deriding him as a sorcerer and a necromancer. This would also be the place, and this is important to mention, where we would see the first legends that will grow up around Agrippa. And there are kind of 5 of these big legends that grew up around him that continue to be told all the way down to this day. And I'll go through them briefly. The first legend, of course, is the legend of the black dog. It is the case that Johann Weyer says that Agrippa did have a black dog. It was a black poodle named Monsieur that Agrippa really loved. Apparently, he really loved this dog. But the legend goes that the Agrippa had actually bound the devil inside of this dog. The devil was stuck inside this dog with a magical collar, and that at the end of Agrippa's life, he was destitute and dying. And Agrippa said, before I die, at least I'm going to, let the devil out. And he takes the magical collar off the dog, and the devil flees from the dog, and the dog runs to a bridge in the river Saône, I think, and jumps off the bridge and dies. And so you get this sad story of this otherwise evil, demon-possessed dog who kills himself. And so that's the main legend of the black dog. Johann Weyer says it's silly, but he says that there really was a dog, but it wasn't possessed by the devil. The other is that Agrippa would labor in his study for days and days at a time, and that weirdly enough, he was able to know what was going on in other places. So he would know that in another place far away that the news was happening. And so there's a sense that he had some kind of ability to engage in remote viewing, what we might call now. And he could also be able to rapidly travel from one lecture to another. So you could travel. He could lecture in Antwerp and then magically go far distances away to Cologne and then lecture there in the afternoon and get back to Antwerp the next day. So allegedly he could basically fly or something like that, or teleport. But the remote viewing is also there as well. Johann Weyer also says that Agrippa had an uncanny knowledge of what was going on in the wider world, but he actually attributes this primarily to the fact that Agrippa was a voracious letter writer and a voracious letter getter. And so he just happened to know what was going on because he just had a very extensive correspondence. And so Weyer again says, yeah, this is true. He did have an uncanny knowledge of what was going on in the world, but it was mostly just because he was well connected via people that he knew in terms of letter writing. So again, this is another one. Another legend is that he had done magical favors for Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Apparently, Charles V had a couple of unexpected military victories, and these military victories are very unusual. And Agrippa was said to have been able to engage in military magic for Charles V. Perhaps my favorite, that's not my favorite, but a good one is that Agrippa would often pay for nights at inns with gold coins, and the gold coins were themselves very unusual. And so he would pay for these times at inns with gold coins, and that once he left, the gold coins would turn into leaves, so that they were not really gold coins. They were some kind of glamour magic, I think is what we would call it, illusion magic, but they were just like leaves made to look like gold coins. So that was another one. My favorite one, though, is the tale of the unlucky boarder. I feel like I'm in Are You Afraid of the Dark episode. At any rate, the tale of the unlucky boarder is that when Agrippa traveled extensively, and the story goes that in his room there were all these books of magic, which I'm sure there were, and that a boarder, someone in the same tavern as Agrippa, would sneak into Agrippa's room, and he read one of these books of magic, and lo and behold, the devil appeared and promptly killed the unlucky boarder. And Agrippa returned home and found a dead body in his room, which is not a good thing. Agrippa already had a bad enough reputation. And so what does Agrippa do? Of course, he reconjures the devil, instructs the devil to re-inhabit the body of the dead boarder, and to walk the dead body back into the center of town, and then leave the dead body there. And the devil, under the command of Agrippa, does in fact inhabit the body of the guy, and walks him possessed into the center of town, and then abandons his body there in the center of the town, so that Agrippa is not blamed for the murder of the unlucky boarder. So these are like the 5 or 6 big pieces of mythology and folklore that begin to travel with the name of Agrippa. And what's interesting about these is that Johann Weyer knows of some of these, at least in his lifetime, at least the black dog one and the remote viewing one, and feels the need to respond to them, to say there's an element of truth to these, but also there's no element of truth to those. I imagine the magical money one is also probably tied up with Agrippa's reputation as an alchemist. He would also sort of be tied up with the Faust legend. The Faust legend is also based on a real person, and Agrippa sort of weirdly becomes integrated with the Faust legend. So much so that when Goethe also is a reader of Agrippa. In fact, Goethe read Agrippa as a young man, and the De Incertitudine kind of prompted a kind of existential crisis, we might say, for the young Goethe. Which that's a hard thing to do in Goethe, is to and make him have an existential crisis. Goethe was the king of existential crises. At any rate, when Goethe finally got around to writing his famous book on Faust, he even changed the name of Faust from the traditional name Johann to Heinrich, in order to basically combine Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa with Johann Faust. And so he literally changes the name to make him more Agrippan. So, and this is a place where Goethe has literally transformed the Faust legend to interpolate Agrippa into it. Again, Agrippa would have never summoned the demon Mephistopheles or any other demon in order to gain knowledge. It's totally opposed to the whole Agrippan idea of what magic was supposed to be. But again, when you have the inconvenience of being dead, and after Johann Weyer is also dead, you don't have really much power in order to defend your reputation. And so this is a place where the Faust legend and the Agrippa legends become conflated. He would also be name dropped by Paracelsus. I should also mention I did some digging, and it does appear that there are a couple of Paracelsian works, early Paracelsian works, in the Paracelsus opera, where Agrippa is mentioned. But the problem with those two works is the two works we have of Paracelsus where Agrippa is mentioned, they are unclear if they are in fact authentic works of Paracelsus. So the jury remains out if Paracelsus and Agrippa actually knew each other. But at least in the first generation of Paracelsians, some of those people definitely knew Agrippa, and he is mentioned in some of the magical works, like I think the Archidosis Magica, he is mentioned in those works. But there's a lot of debate about whether or not Paracelsus even wrote those. So at any rate, a possible overlap between Paracelsus and Agrippa there. At any rate, one of the last places in literature where Agrippa really does show up in an important way is in Frankenstein. What ends up happening, of course, in that book is that Shelley has Victor Frankenstein discussing the new experiments that he's doing over in school with his father. And Victor's father refers to Paracelsus and to Agrippa as sad trash. So Agrippa is referred to as sad trash in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So I can tell at this point that his reputation is not all that great by the time of Shelley. Agrippa, however, is widely known in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. In fact, he shows up in a good bit of literature at that time. I would say that one of the few people who seems to actually have any idea about what Agrippa actually wrote is Christopher Marlowe in the Tragical Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. If you can read the quote on the screen, this is Faustus, of course, speaking, and but he sort of invokes Agrippa. And what is interesting here is that how he invokes Agrippa is to combine both Agrippa's penchant towards skepticism, but also the idea that magic is in some ways the cure to skepticism. And notice that in this way, Agrippa's skepticism and his magical occult philosophy are combined. And I'll say that this quote of Marlowe shows to me that Marlowe actually read Agrippa, unlike almost everyone else who did not, I think, largely read Agrippa. But this is a case where I think we actually have someone who's read him. Marlowe clearly has read him and has done some interesting work combining biographical data about Agrippa along with other elements, of course. However, the idea of solving things with infernal spirits, not very Agrippan. But I will say that this quotation from Marlowe is one of the longest extended quotations about where Agrippa is invoked, and I think that he is. Now, this last line, right, that who's going to be more cunning than Agrippa, whose shadow made all Europe honor him. I would say that this is not the case. That Agrippa was not honored through all of Europe. He was recognized as an authority, but in general, he was worried deeply. People worried deeply about the fact that he was engaged in criminal necromancy. And to a significant degree, I'll say that the magia reformata that Agrippa had hoped for, it didn't really come to anything. There's no evidence, to my knowledge, that the idea of a magical reformation, with a few exceptions, people like Guillaume Postel, but Postel's going to go more in a very specifically kind of Kabbalistic direction. But I don't see any evidence, or very little evidence, that Agrippa's larger magical reformation was ever carried forward, even in literature. I don't know that there's a single person, to my knowledge, that takes the entire ideas to be found in the 3 books of occult philosophy and says, let's dig that deeper, let's transform that, let's keep doing that. In general, I think that the magia reformata basically died on the vine. And so in that way, I think that Agrippa's big vision for what he wanted ultimately did not come to much of anything. And I think part of the reason why that is because Agrippa just became too heterodox. Agrippa simply became a bad fit for everybody. And I mean, what I mean is Agrippa was always too Catholic for the Protestants. He was never going to be accepted by the Protestants. He was always too Catholic. I think he was far too magical for the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation really shut down a lot of the kind of hermetic spirituality that was being developed primarily in Italy. And so much of that was developing along Ficino and Pico and those kinds of lines, the Counter-Reformation really dug their heels in. And the Roman Inquisition that arose in the aftermath or during the time period of people like Giordano Bruno, well, you can see what they did to Bruno. They burned him alive, and they burned him with wet wood to make him burn longer. this was not going to be in the cards. The Counter-Reformation really shut the door in so many ways to the kind of avant-garde Catholicism that was being pioneered by people like Agrippa. Of course, with the rise of Cartesianism, that's just he's far too religious to be a Cartesian. The Cartesians are not going to go with him in the direction of the kind of mystical skepticism that Agrippa put forward. Although I will say that Descartes was a bit more of a mystic than people actually give him credit for, or that he's recognized as. But the Cartesian skepticism is also not going to be compatible with the kind of illuminationist religious illuminationism that would go on for Agrippa. The Enlightenment would also emerge, and Agrippa would be thought of as fundamentally superstitious or backwards for the Enlightenment, and so he had no chance of survival in those airs. And I will say that even with the occult revival beginning in the 19th century with people like Ebenezer Sibley and Barrett and other folks, well, frankly, Agrippa is going to be too Christian for them. Part of what's going to happen in the 19th century is that the occult revivalists are really increasingly wanting to move away from Christianity, and Agrippa is just saturated. He's a Christian through and through. And so for the occult revival, and eventually you can get to people like Aleister Crowley. Crowley's not going to have much time for the deep religious piety of someone like Agrippa, and therefore he's not going to be a good fit there either. And so part of the reason why I think Agrippa doesn't get carried forward is he's just too much in every direction. He doesn't really fit the box that everyone wants to put him in. And so because he doesn't fit the box everyone wants to put him in, he kind of gets left out of the canon in some ways. He becomes like everyone acknowledges that he's important, but there's no one there to carry his flag forward. And so in many ways, I think that it's the fact that he remains an outsider. I think that ultimately means that the project that he was going to put forward would have never gone forward. And further, what is the kind of magic that ultimately carries the day in early modern Europe? And that answer is relatively straightforward. It's necromancy. It's the medieval style necromantic magic that had always been popular in Europe. And in many ways, I think the necromancers probably looked at Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy and said, you can't do anything with this. It's great philosophy. It sounds good. It's interesting. But at the end of the day, aside from some talismans, you can't really do anything with this. And magic has always been, from the earliest ancient times all the way down till now. If you ask people like Dr. Stephen Skinner or other kinds of folks, they're going to tell you magic is about results, about getting stuff done. And I appreciate that. As again, I take my lead from magical practitioners in that way. It's certainly not for me to magic explain them. But at the end of the day, the 3 books of occult philosophy doesn't get anything done. You can't do much with it. And so, unsurprisingly, what's going to carry the day in terms of a magical practice is going to be the good old-fashioned necromancy that had been carrying the day for 500 years at that point. And so texts like the Key of Solomon are going to continue to be hugely popular. And eventually texts like the 4th book on occult philosophy, which I've covered in last week's episode, or this week's episode, I can't tell which month I'm in anymore. Those kinds of texts prove enormously popular. And of course, texts like the Lesser Key of Solomon, which will be composed about 100 years after Agrippa's dead, that text is going to prove to be enormously popular in contemporary occultism. So you just can't square the circle between a text like the Lesser Key of Solomon or the Goetia specifically with a larger Agrippan-like text. Now, the way that you could square that circle is by very carefully editing Agrippa to make him more amenable to that kind of magic. And that's exactly what the 1801 text, The Magus by Francis Barrett, that's precisely what he had done. Sometimes it's referred to that Barrett's text is a plagiarized version of Agrippa, and I don't think that's quite true. And I've actually said that myself, and I should be careful to publicly say that I think I'm wrong about that, and to change my position about that. What Barrett's wanting to do basically is create a workable magical manual in the 1801 The Magus. And how he plans to do that basically is to go back to the major text of magic, which at that point had become very rare. In fact, Barrett even says that finding copies of the 3 books of occult philosophy are very expensive, and even in 1801. And so what Barrett does is he goes to the 3 books of occult philosophy, he goes to the 4th book of occult philosophy, and he goes to the Heptameron. And he carefully edits those texts in such a way as to basically make them a workable magical grimoire, So he gets basically a cosmology and some amulet magic from the 3 books. He gets the 4th book, which is very practical, and the Heptameron, of course, which is extremely practical. And he publishes as the 1801 the Magus largely as a kind of advertisement. He's like, look, guys, I want to make a magical society and I want to do magic. And this is the kind of book that I've basically put out to do magic. And so, in many ways, what you get in the 1801 text of Francis Barrett's The Magus is you get the 3 books of occult philosophy edited as part of a continuum with the 4th book and as a part of a continuum with the Heptameron. The 4th book and the Heptameron, I think the Agrippa himself would have deeply disliked. In fact, I know he would have disliked the Heptameron because Agrippa straight up says you can't conjure angels. And that's the whole point of that book. And so I don't think Agrippa would have had anything to do with it. But the version that most people end up getting from Agrippa, from the 3 books of occult philosophy, are from the Magus. And so the Magus's version of the 3 books of occult philosophy ultimately make their way into more Thelemic and Wiccan circles and like things like, I think, like the Buckland Manual and other kinds of stuff. And so the actual 3 books of occult philosophy, I think, basically beginning with Magus, the 1801, the version of Agrippa we get is this practicalized version of Agrippa. And that affects, because it's been very carefully edited, has actually taken out all the philosophical elements of Agrippa's actual occult philosophy. In fact, it's removed the occult philosophy. And those sections are reintegrated into other practices like the Golden Dawn, like Bucklandian, I suppose, Wicca. And so the story there is a genealogical story that shows you the power of printing, that who gets to a book first and edits it first often controls the destiny of what that book is. And so largely what we've inherited is not the philosophy of Agrippa, but a de-philosophical text largely edited to make it practical in the scope of basically doing magic a la the 4th book and the Heptameron in the 1801. And of course, as those are taken up into Golden Dawn style magic or Thelemic style magic or other kind of magic into the 20th century, that is the version you're going to get. And that practicalized version is not, in my mind, a reflection of actually Agrippa's overall philosophy. So again, whether that's a bug or a feature depends on you. But I will say that that is part of the destiny or the vicissitude of how all this has shaped itself out. So, so what do we get with Agrippa in the 20th century? Well, as I mentioned, a great deal of the occult philosophy of the 20th century was a rejection of Christianity. And so insofar it was a rejection of Christianity, what's ended up happening overall is that Renaissance occultism has largely been passed over because it was too Christian. Frankly, Ficino was a priest. Pico was deeply Christian. These elements are just not, they're not going to play ball with something like paganism. If you're rejecting Christianity and moving in the direction of worshiping the Norse gods or the Wiccan deities or something like this, Agrippa just doesn't make any sense to you because he's Christian and the system is entirely Christian. And so in that way, Agrippa and Ficino and the other guys have basically been passed over because they're just not that useful for those traditions. And I would say that even the Enochian magic, that when you study Enochian magic carefully, most occultists don't really take seriously how Christian Dee is. You will never see all of the prayers that Dee mentions in the True and Faithful Relation that basically inaugurate every single angel conversation. Those are the closest thing we get to invocations in all of John Dee's writing. Those are never mentioned because they're overwhelmingly, straightforwardly Christian prayers. And that is just not going to play ball if you're going to be a Thelemite typically, and that you're not in the same kind of paradigm. So what's ultimately end up entering into the 20th century has largely been an interest in goetic magic. So that kind of goetic magic remains incredibly popular. And again, this is simply not compatible with an Agrippan philosophical magical program. So insofar as the Lesser Key of Solomon or other kinds of forms of magic like that are going to be interesting, that's not going to work. And then further, another form of magic that's not going to work are kind of what we might call grimoire traditionalism. Grimoire traditionalism has had a huge explosion in popularity, especially in the past 20 or 30 years. And that's exactly the kind of magic Agrippa didn't want anything to do with. And so in many ways, if you look at a text like the Heptameron or I don't know, the Liber Iuratus, which is a bit closer to what something maybe like Agrippa would like to have dealt with, none of those texts are ultimately going to be the kind of magic that is going to agree with the three books of occult philosophy. So I would say that in many ways, the occult, capital O, has had very little to do with Agrippa because Agrippa is simply a bad fit for their respective agendas, whether that be neo-paganism, whether that be goetic magic, or whether that be other forms of contemporary magical practice. In general, I would say that Agrippa is a bad fit. It's paradigmatically a bad fit. And that's just to say that most of the emphasis has been on Agrippa has primarily been placed on academically studying him, largely within the larger context of Renaissance studies. And a great deal of those studies have been highly specialized. Many of them have been in Italian. The greatest scholarship on Agrippa has it been almost totally done in Italian in the 20th century, with a couple of exceptions. And so one of the things I think has hindered access to Agrippa as maybe a resource for contemporary occultists has been the fact that people just haven't had access to him. There's basically been one English edition for most of the 20th century, and that English edition was the so-called JF translation that was done in the 17th century. It's extraordinarily unreliable, and there are printing errors, there are translation errors in it. I will say that Donald Tyson had attempted to correct some of that and provide practical notes for practicing occultists. Unfortunately, the Tyson notes are often make the situation even worse. And so the JF translation was bad to start with, and in many ways was made worse. And so what we have is just a lack of access. It was an accessibility question, I think, to some significant degree. That has changed now with the Purdue translation and the Summers Young translation, both of which I think are quite good. I think that Purdue, I prefer the Purdue translation myself, but hopefully with those translations being made, and hopefully with the translations that Dr. Dana Trell and I are working on, that hopefully we'll be rolling out here in the next week or so, we can begin to see an increase in interest and study of Agrippa, both from a academic point of view, but also from hopefully from a from a practitioner point of view. I'd love to see and converse with practitioners along the lines of what can be I know, salvage from Agrippa. I'd love to see the world, a flourishing world of Christian occultism, because again, there is a huge world of Christian occultism, and it's a pity that that world is basically largely doesn't exist now. At any rate, Agrippa, sadly, also, even among non-occultists, is virtually unknown in philosophy. You will never hear about Agrippa in a philosophy class. You will not study him in the religious studies canon, unfortunately. So Agrippa has been passed over as basically a non-entity. And so we don't learn about him, and we don't learn about his unique contributions to the history of Western spirituality and Western magic and Western philosophy, even though I do think that he's made a pretty important impact, even if it's primarily symbolically, but I do think he has actually made an impact in many ways. So I end on a sort of a sad note, but a happy note in many ways. I end on the sad note that I think Agrippa is more celebrated than known, to crib Voltaire. I think that people know the name, but people don't really study the texts, and I think that they're unfortunately not studied in a way that has made Agrippa not accessible to people, and I think this is a bit of a pity. And I also say that his whole business, this little project of the Magia Reformata, is also largely unknown, and it certainly was unrealized. No one carried it forward to any kind of conclusion. And so in many ways, I think Agrippa, unfortunately, so and this is the bad news, Agrippa largely is misunderstood, ignored, and not really appreciated for his project. And I think this is a great loss for our understanding of the history of philosophy and the history of religious studies, the history of Christian philosophy. I think all of these remain unfortunately unrealized aspects of this. Now, I'll say that the other thing is that the good news, as we wrap up, is that Agrippa is now getting a lot more attention. With the new translations, people can now access Agrippa in a more full way. I think the interest in this seminar has been proof that people are interested in Agrippa. They do want to get to know what he said, even if it's the case that they're ultimately not going to follow him in his project. There is a desire, I think, on in a general audience. I think I looked at one of the episodes of the last lecture just the other day, and it had nearly 10,000 views. 10,000 views on a 13th part of an Agrippa lecture is bizarre. That makes no sense, frankly. But the fact that nearly 10,000 people have decided to key into the 13th lecture, or I don't know how many people ultimately will have watched all of these over time. But I do think that that represents an important sea change and an interest in Agrippa. And I really do hope that that continues, and I do hope we see a deepening and a broadening in the interest in Agrippa, but also in Renaissance magic and philosophy more generally. I think Ficino and Pico and other people like this deserve their day in the sun just as much as Agrippa. And so we leave Agrippa. This is where basically we leave him. And I leave him in many ways I leave him in a place where I think there's something very special. And I think back to the letter he wrote in November of 1527, where Agrippa tells us that he, quote, remains forever before the doors, and he shows others which path must be entered. That we leave Agrippa, and in many ways, we read that line last week as a bit of a tragedy, that Agrippa himself had never experienced the very illumination that he'd written about. But also, I think we get a kind of bodhisattva Agrippa in a way too. And I say that what I say there is Agrippa, despite the fact perhaps that he never received the illumination that he sought, he remains at the doors, and he remains there forever, pointing us in the direction that we should perhaps go. And I will say that there's something inspiring about the idea that Agrippa remains for us, pointing in the direction of a philosophy that looks primarily at the dignity of the human being, at the desire for the human being to dignify themselves through illumination with the divine, and ultimately, in that moment of divine illumination, to gain powers over the world, but not powers over the world to control it or to get stuff or to extract things in some instrumental sense, but power over the world to redeem it, power over the world to regenerate oneself and to regenerate humanity, to reform humanity from false knowledge and from false wisdom into real wisdom. And Agrippa points the direction in that direction of human dignity, in that direction of divine illumination, in that use of power for the good, and ultimately, not just for the good of in an abstract sense, but for a profound experience of felicity, of joy. And I think that of all the things that we can look to in a philosopher, what better can we look forward to a philosopher who will spend eternity, I think, remaining himself at the door, pointing us in the direction of a philosophy for which human dignity is of the most importance, for which illumination is a great goal, for which power over nature, power over the sublime, is for the good of everyone, for the reformation of society. And finally, a philosophy that says, ultimately, what we achieve, if we have done everything, is immense, infinite joy, felicity. And I think that in that, Agrippa remains at the doors, pointing us in the direction of human dignity, of the illumination of the intellect, and of felicity. I think he is a philosopher that we all owe a great deal of study, and we all owe an enormous amount of respect. And it's with that that we will leave Agrippa, pointing us in the direction of those things. And I hope that we may merit to pass through those gates ourselves, to pass through those doors ourselves, and to thank Agrippa as we do.
All right. Well done. You just watched 15 or so hours of a seminar in Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's occult philosophy. Thank you. Thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for watching this content. It's been an enormous joy to produce. I feel extremely grateful to have been able to produce this class, this seminar, and with a deep amount of gratitude toward my viewers and especially my patrons. Thank you. Thank you for letting me do the work that I find to be so important and nourishing. And it's amazing to be able to reach out to Agrippa and really connect with him and make what I think is truly a beautiful occult philosophy accessible, more accessible to historians, average people interested in the history of philosophy, and especially to my practitioner community. Thank you all for taking the time to watch. Again, just one more reminder, this entire seminar is an experiment. It is an experiment in crowd-funded education. I am not charging anything to put this out here. The only thing I am asking is if you found these over, 15 hours of lectures and seminar, if you found it worthwhile, if you've come away with it thinking, that was worth it. I watched the whole thing and it was worth it. The only thing I'm asking, take a look at my Patreon, take a look at donating to my PayPal, support the channel, buy a t-shirt, whatever. It doesn't matter. If you can do that, if you can go over to the Patreon, sign up for a $54 support the channel for a year thing. It's like less than buying me a coffee a month. It'll make it worth it because it'll allow me to do the next class. And that next class is coming next spring probably, and it's going to be focusing probably, there's still some debate about what we'll be doing, but probably on Merkava, Hechelut mysticism, the 800-year plus form of Jewish mysticism that from St. Paul to the Kabbalah may have, in fact, I would argue, transformed Western religious history more than anyone actually appreciates. So we'll come back to that. We'll have a whole new seminar next year. But again, if you found this Agrippa seminar interesting, worthwhile, I'd ask you support the channel if you can. And if you can't, financially, for whatever reason, I would never ask anyone to support this channel financially if it is a serious burden to them. Please do not do that. But if you can, I'd appreciate it. And again, thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.